Welcome to That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions, sometimes all three in one episode. I'm your host, Rhian Rogan, and before we jump into the really good stuff, I'll share some highlights about me and why I was inspired to start this podcast in the first place. I explained a bit in the trailer, but I don't think people actually listen to podcast trailers, so here we go. I'm a young Black millennial woman born and raised in Houston, Texas. I have a degree from the University of Pittsburgh and another from UCLA. I know what a dial-up connection sounds like, and I've also been very annoyed when the internet on a plane was too slow for me to stream a Beyonce album. The average student loan debt burden has tripled since I was potty trained, and I've seen the success and failure of multiple women's professional sports leagues. I don't understand why we charge kids to eat lunch at schools they're forced to attend, but don't charge them to ride the bus. And hey, consultants, don't start telling school districts to charge kids to ride the bus. Companies are still offering unpaid internships. America has been at war in Afghanistan for nearly 2/3 of my life, but I'd wager a large majority of the US population couldn't find Kabul on a map. Beyonce has never won Album of the Year at the Grammys. Home ownership is a pipe dream for many in my generation. It was easier for me to purchase a handgun in Texas than it was to register a vehicle I bought in California. It's April 2021. Super rich people got way more super richer in the last year, while lines at food banks got way longer. Meanwhile, the US has a sub-minimum wage. College endowments are huge but untouchable, and I've seen videos of Black men and women murdered by the police, sometimes captured by the police officer's own camera. And every time I think to myself, that can't be right. How do we fix it? So I'm doing the research and asking the experts. I hope you'll join me. Follow or subscribe in the app you're using to listen to my voice. Check me out on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. Let's jump into it. Welcome to That Can't Be Right, a podcast dedicated to exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. Please like, subscribe, follow, leave a review, tell a friend. Today, I'm joined by Emma Platoff. Emma covers politics and government for the Boston Globe, where she started in 2021. Previously, she spent 4 years covering justice, politics, and COVID-19 for the Texas Tribune. A Connecticut native, Emma is a graduate of Yale and a former managing editor of the Yale Daily News. Emma, welcome to That Can't Be Right.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, to set the stage, a few months ago, this guy, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General in Texas, filed a lawsuit seeking to overturn 2020 election results in 4 battleground states, which was weird because Texas was not a battleground state. And second, it was weird because I knew he had been in trouble with the law, but I didn't know the full scope. So I Googled Ken Paxton lawsuit, and I probably read every article Emma wrote on the Texas Tribune, trying to understand what was going on and why it was dragging on so long. It's a ride. So I want to talk to the expert herself about who Ken Paxton is, what's happening. So let's jump it straight in. Who is Ken Paxton?
It's a great question, and I would certainly watch the movie that answers that question. Ken Paxton is a Texas Republican elected official. If you think about Republicans in Texas as sort of existing on a spectrum from a moderate who maybe might have backed a Joe Biden over a Donald Trump to someone who's more aligned with the Tea Party wing of the party, that's where you would place Ken Paxton. He's very conservative, Christian. He's a person who talks about things like family values and religious liberty. He's a staunch supporter of former President Trump and big focus on issues like border security, that type of thing. He joined the Texas legislature in the early 2000s. He was first elected to the Texas House, and he's from North Texas, a suburb of the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
And this is an aside, but how did covering Ken Paxton in the last several years affect your sleep schedule? Because there was a lot of breaking news, there was just a lot. So how did it affect your sleep schedule?
Any reporter would tell you that to have a great story to cover is a privilege, but it can also be exhausting. So particularly in fall of 2020, leading up to the presidential election, of course, and later the failed election challenge that you mentioned, There was also sort of a new leveling of criminal allegations against Ken Paxton that certainly had an impact on my sleep schedule. But it's just been it's a really interesting story, start to finish, and it certainly hasn't finished yet.
Okay, so let's get to it, because I think also in the last 4 years, the public's perception of what an attorney general does and doesn't do has been skewed by the federal attorney general. So other than confusing people by being pluralized attorneys general, what is an attorney general's responsibility?
So state attorneys general have really broad jobs, and it can be a little bit confusing. So it's a little different in every state. In Texas, Paxton heads an agency of about 4,000 people. Almost half of that agency is dedicated to child support. So not something you might think would be a huge part of the role of the agency when you listen to sort of the things that Ken Paxton likes to talk about on Fox News. But it's a really broad job, right? So there are attorneys with that agency who are working on environmental lawsuits. They are defending state agencies when they get sued. And the thing that brings state attorneys general most into the headlines is when they like to sue the federal government. This is something that Texas actually was really a pioneer in with Ken Paxton's predecessor, who's now the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott. President Obama elected, more than a decade ago, and Republican attorneys general thought, shoot, okay, how can we push back on this? He has the whole federal government in his party, right? They had control. So they thought, okay, we'll sue him. And this turned out to be a really popular approach. It only gained steam under President Trump. You had states like California suing the federal government instead of states like Texas. And now that we have Joe Biden in the White House, it's flipped right back. So the thing that people probably know Ken Paxton for the most outside of Texas is these lawsuits against the federal government. So a really prominent one, as you mentioned, was this attempt, which failed, to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. But he's also challenging Joe Biden constantly on issues like immigration.
Of course. And wow, I didn't know the scope or the size of his office or how the resources are allocated. So thank you for that context. So we've set the stage. We know what Ken Paxton does for work, but he's been accused of some crimes. So what was he accused of and when, I think, is also a very important part of that question.
So if you look at the criminal allegations against Ken Paxton, there's two buckets. I'll start with the older allegations. So Paxton was elected Attorney General in 2014 for the first time. He's now serving his second term. And in 2015, so right into his first term, he was indicted on securities fraud charges. These are, white collar crimes. And the allegation is basically that he misled investors while trying to persuade them to invest in a company, and he didn't disclose that he was going to make a commission. So you might think, okay, that sounds like a boring white collar crime that I would expect, that's not so atypical for what you might see from a politician. The interesting thing about those charges is that he has yet to go to trial, and it's been 5.5 years at this point. And that is its own long and winding story that could fill your entire hour. But essentially, there have just been these side battles over and over for years, bouncing up from the low district courts in Texas all the way up to the state's highest courts. And basically the questions are, how much will the state pay the prosecutors who are trying to take him to trial? And where will the case be tried? Is it fair to try Ken Paxton in the suburbs of Dallas-Fort Worth, where he grew, where he has represented the district for so long, where his wife is now a state senator? Do his political allyships there make it impossible for the government to get a fair trial? So those are the questions that are holding up that prosecution.
Okay.
There's also the second bucket, which maybe, I don't know if you want to get into it now, but these are potentially more serious allegations. It's been reported that the FBI is investigating. And essentially the claim is that Paxton used the power of his office, so the agency, the Attorney General's office, to do political favors for a donor, Nate Paul. And Nate Paul is a real estate investor in Austin, and they're sort of friendly, as we've reported. And Paul is an important donor to Paxton's campaigns. And so that is something I should be very clear he has not been charged for yet, but the reporting indicates that the FBI is looking at that.
Yes. So we have two buckets. The second bucket is a whole bucket of worms that I definitely want to get to because there's been some movement in his office that is really important. Let's focus on the first bucket for now. So you mentioned the two most important things about why the case has dragged on so long, like how much the state is willing to pay the prosecutors versus, and also where the trial should be. I think I read someone sued that the rate that was agreed upon for the prosecutors was too high. So what is Ken Paxton saying, or what are his representatives saying that this is how much the prosecutors should be paid for this trial?
So the way this issue even got started is that a Paxton donor sued the county and said, you're paying these prosecutors too much. The rate that they had agreed upon with the judge was $300 per hour, which if you're a journalist sounds like a ton of money. And if you are a lawyer sounds like not that much money, actually. A super white shoe law firm, you could easily be charging $1,200 an hour. So the sort of kink in this system, and it gets a little bit wonky, is that special prosecutors, who are the people taking Paxton to trial in this case, are paid based on the state law that says how much lawyers are paid to represent indigent defendants. And so there's been some dispute about how to interpret that law, basically. And the prosecutors say, this is the rate we agreed on. This is a reasonable number to pay experienced attorneys. And Paxton defenders and folks on the right overwhelmingly say $300 an hour is a crazy amount of money. Why are we paying these people? They just want a payday. They don't want justice. And so we've seen this bounce to just about every court in the state of Texas, and it has still not been fully resolved.
Of course not. And I do have a question or a point of clarification that maybe you can help with. The man who sued the county that decided the prosecutor's rate, he wasn't a resident of the county, was he?
I would have to check that.
Okay. So nobody wants to pay the prosecutors a ton of money. How is Ken Paxton himself funding his defense?
Well, there's been an interesting sort of legal question around that too. So Paxton started basically accepting gifts or donations from political allies, from family friends, to fund his legal defense. We mentioned that the prosecutors want to be paid $300 an hour. The defense attorneys aren't cheap either, right? If you want to have good representation. And so Paxton started accepting these gifts to fund his defense. These are, in the tens of thousands of dollars. It's a lot of money. And the interesting problem here is that as a state official, there are pretty strict rules about what kind of gifts you can accept, right? Because sometimes when you get a gift and you're an elected official, we call that a bribe. So far, no one has really it hasn't come to a head. He's still been able to do this, though certainly this is the kind of thing that makes ethics experts raise their eyebrows.
For sure. Yeah, that seems very strange that he's been able to do that. But prosecutors pay, and you said it's bounced all over the different courts in Texas. What do other officials in Texas have to say? Has the governor weighed in? Has Lieutenant Governor weighed in? Senators?
For the most part, this is something that Republican officials in Texas don't really want to touch. And I think a big part of that, you can look at the results of the 2018 elections. So Paxton, at that point, has been under this indictment for more than 3 years. His Democratic opponent, a guy named Justin Nelson, makes basically his entire campaign about the fact that our state attorney general, the top legal official in our state, has been under indictment for 3 years. Like, is that something, he's making that the case to voters. And yet, with all that hanging over his head, Paxton is reelected. It's a much narrower margin than he was elected by in his first term in 2014. I think it was about 3 or 4 percentage points, which as a Republican in Texas is a scary number for you. Republicans in Texas want to be winning in the double digits. Yeah. And so I think that is really important political context, right? If you are a Republican official, especially if you're worried that Democrats like Beto O'Rourke are about to beat you in statewide elections, what incentive do you have to really get involved in this case against Ken Paxton when it seems like voters are still supporting him. And so we don't hear much from people about it. The sort of a standard party line would be, I look forward to seeing how the court decides that. And, that's a legal matter and that's not for me to judge before it's been resolved.
Thank you for providing that context. I hadn't considered that because it was very surprising in doing the research that everybody was kind of saying, yes, well, let's see how it plays out. Let's see how the legal system evaluates things. Do you think the approach would be different if we were in a state where the Attorney General was appointed?
That's a good question. And it's hard to know for sure. Mm-hmm. I mean, my understanding is that if Paxton were to leave office, depending on when in his term he did that, the governor would get to appoint a replacement. So that may be something that some people are considering. I think the important point that folks in sort of grassroots conservative circles have made to me about the first set of Paxton allegations, and this is distinct from the more recent allegations, which I'm sure we'll get to, is that you have to think about when this is happening, right? So Paxton is indicted in 2015. In Texas, around the same time, Rick Perry, just a few years earlier, was pursued by who some conservatives might say like an overzealous Democratic-leaning prosecutor. So you had just seen this situation in which Rick Perry was pursued for kind of abusing his office, and ultimately the charges are dropped and nothing ever comes of it. And so some Republicans look at this first set of Paxton allegations and say, okay, he was soliciting, he was trying to persuade investors and he wasn't registered as a securities agent. Why is that such a horrific crime, right? I think we can all acknowledge that that's sort of a little bit different from like killing someone. Mm-hmm. And so I think that for some people on the right, it felt like there are these overzealous Democratic-leaning prosecutors, their words, who are going after someone for what they consider to be a relatively minor crime. Think again about the political context of the last 5 years or so. You have Donald Trump in the White House talking about the Democrats' witch hunt, and you see a lot of that language used also in Texas. Paxton describes himself as sort of the victim of this politically motivated attack. And I think that language is persuasive to a lot of his voters, as it was persuasive for a lot of Trump voters. And so I just say that as sort of a backdrop for the whole situation. If people are wondering, how can someone win re-election with this indictment hanging over their head? You have to think about, this is a very conservative state. This is an incumbent that they know. This is someone who sued Obama all the time. His wife had a song about how Ken Paxton would sue Obama. And it's worth a Google. So there's a lot of pieces in the puzzle, I guess, is the point I'm making.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think definitely wasn't aware of the song, and will absolutely be running to YouTube after we're done talking. But I think that, again, that's really excellent context, because that resonates with people, as we saw in the 2020 election, as we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, that they definitely perceive some sort of slight, some sort of over-aggressive, like you're saying, prosecutors. But I think that's a good opportunity to move to these new allegations, where, let me have you explain them, because I think they do, it's very different about who's making the accusations, I think, to start. So what was Ken Paxton accused of most recently?
So in October of 2020, it's this really busy time. We're leading up to the presidential election, of course. There are lawsuits left and right. The story leaks out initially in the Austin American-Statesman that a number of top officials in the Texas Attorney General's office have told authorities that they believe Ken Paxton may be breaking the law. And specifically, they say they think he may be abusing his office and he may have committed bribery. And so immediately in the political atmosphere, everyone is thinking, okay, this is different. There's no argument that this is sort of a minor crime. And importantly, you have to look at where the accusations are coming from. So the people who are laying out these accusations and who went to authorities with them are Paxton's top 8 senior people in his office. These are handpicked attorneys who work for him. These are the people he works with every day. One of them is a guy named Jeff Mateer, who's known in sort of Texas conservative legal circles to be very conservative, very strong on issues like religious liberty, very popular figure on the right. He was actually appointed to a federal court by Trump and didn't end up getting confirmed because of some controversial statements he had made in the past. But this is a guy who you can't look at and try to claim with a straight face, oh, this is a Democrat going after Ken Paxton, right? This is someone who's trusted in conservative circles. And so days go on, newspaper reporters are working frantically, and the Houston Chronicle lands this big story, basically laying out, okay, we know that they're saying he may have committed bribery, that he may have abused his office. What is this all about? And ultimately, we learn through a lot of really great local reporting that the broad scope of the allegation is that Paxton did favors using the power of his office for this guy, Nate Paul, who's a political donor, who's sort of a big picture real estate investor in Texas. Some of sources I spoke to at the time said he's almost aiming to be sort of like a Trump-like figure in building a real estate empire, but one that had serious problems as well. And right, so the broad scope of the allegation is, did Ken Paxton use his office, use the power of this 4,000 person office, which is funded by state taxpayer dollars, to do favors for this guy who's a political donor? And immediately the question is, okay, if he did that, then why did he do it?
Right. And I wonder if it has anything to do with funding his other legal defense. But that's a very amateur hypothesis. So the people in his office make these allegations. What happens to them? They can't just go back to work and be like, hey, boss, what's for lunch?
Well, they try to do that. And ultimately what you end up seeing is there were 8 whistleblowers who went to authorities, and ultimately they just start getting fired. Some of them are placed on leave. A few of them resign. You can sort of imagine what the conference room conversation sounds like in the weeks after this story breaks. And a number of them are fired, which is pretty striking, right? You publicly level a serious accusation against your boss, and then you're fired. And in Texas, you have a strong protection in a situation like that through the Texas whistleblower law, which basically says that if you are fired within 90 days of filing a whistleblower complaint, then the law assumes that you were fired in retaliation. And these terminations happened within a month, within 2 months of these allegations becoming public. And so immediately it starts to look like, okay, this is going to be yet another legal problem for Paxton to deal with.
So my immediate thought is, why didn't he just wait 3 months to fire them? Keep them on the equivalent of the bench in the office, wait, and then he has that, I guess, plausible deniability. But again, amateur hypothesis. So
a lot of people would ask that question. And what he would tell you, what his spokesman told me when I asked, why were these people fired, is these were not acts of retaliation. We fired them for cause, essentially, because one of them was insubordinate, because they weren't good at their jobs, all these types of things, which, as you can imagine, was not a fully persuasive explanation, certainly to some of the whistleblowers themselves who ended up filing a lawsuit, but also to the general public, right? These are your hand-picked top guys. And you suddenly decided that a number of them were incompetent very shortly after these allegations were public. I think for a lot of people, that does not pass the smell test.
No, not at all. Not at all. So those 8 people have left the office, fired, resigned, quit. You mentioned the Whistleblower Protection Act. What kind of protections does that include? If they wanted, would there be a path for them back to their jobs? So
a lot of them do want that, and that is the path they're pursuing through the courts right now. So 4 of them filed a lawsuit. They said this was wrongful termination. We want to be reinstated. We want back pay for the months we had. all these types of things. And that is something that's currently being litigated.
Okay. Got it.
But the interesting thing about that lawsuit is, in addition to potentially being a way for these senior attorneys to get their jobs back, which some of them say they do want, it's also a way for more information to emerge about sort of the basis of the allegations against Paxton, right? So, okay, you said bribery. So what was the bribe and what did he do? What was the favor? And a lot of that has come out in the media. There are sort of four main favors that Paxton is accused of doing for Nate Paul. These go, one range from things like helping encourage his staff to release open records to Nate Paul. The Attorney General's office, in addition to doing about a million other things, is the arbiter of open records law in Texas. And so when Nate Paul saw that an open records dispute wasn't going his way, the allegation is that Paxton tried to step in. So examples of that. And all of this starts to leak out through the media. But importantly, now all eyes are on this lawsuit, because once you're in a lawsuit, you have the power that I unfortunately don't have as a reporter, which is you can call people in for a deposition. You can put people on the record in the public setting and say, did you do this? Did you do that? And when I ask those questions, public officials can ignore me.
Right.
But when a court of law is asking those questions, it becomes a much more serious situation.
Got it. And has Nate Paul been accused of anything specifically, like prior to this entanglement with Ken Paxton?
Nate Paul was raided by the FBI about a year before this all happened. He has not been charged.
Oh, okay. But that, you must be attracting some pretty serious attention if they're going to raid your offices. So that's where everybody is now. Like, Ken Paxton still hasn't resigned, given that those people are still trying to get their jobs back in his office. And we'll have to see how that plays out. For you personally, what was the most surprising, what was the most important thing you learned kind of covering these two separate sagas?
That's a good question. It's hard to say one thing, but I think I would point back to the power of, I guess I would point to the fact that sometimes political power is the best tool in your toolkit. So these allegations emerge, and immediately we're thinking, okay, what is John Cornyn going to say about this, a U.S. Senator from Texas? What is Greg Abbott, the former Attorney General, now Governor of Texas, going to say about this? This sort of puts them in the spotlight in a way that I assume they do not want to be in. Do they want to condemn a Republican colleague who a lot of their voters also like? Do they want to support him, and then maybe he ends up getting convicted with something, and that doesn't look good for them? And the path that a lot of them took was sort of cautious. They said, these are serious allegations, and, I look forward to the results of an investigation. And I think what that tells us is that if you're a Republican in Texas, sometimes the biggest thing you need to worry about is whether your voters are sticking with you. And if you can survive politically, you can hang on through legal troubles that others might assume would sink you. A lot of people would be surprised to learn that Paxton was reelected despite these allegations. And so that barometer for measuring power becomes really important.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that was probably one of the biggest, that can't be right moments in why I reached out, because it was so long. It dragged on through re-election. He was elected during a non-presidential election year. So it was very interesting to see how he was able to hold on. So that's Ken Paxton. What a ride. And that was all in a short 5 years that all this has happened. Is there anything else that you think it's important for people to know as they're trying to keep up with the news as more possibly allegations or resolutions emerge in these cases?
Well, I cover state government, so I'm always that loser at parties who is saying, do you guys research your state lawmakers? Do you know what's up with them? And so I think, one thing is it's important for us to be informed about who our elected officials are. And I guess the other thing I would point you to is there is a very clear way to measure the cost that Paxton's personal criminal allegations that these legal troubles will have on the state of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are multiple cases in which taxpayers are going to effectively foot the bill. One of them is in this whistleblower lawsuit we mentioned. So this is a lawsuit against the state because the Attorney General's office, the state agency, is the entity that fired these people. And so if they win, if they get back pay, if they get damages, those are state dollars that they'll be getting. That's not, no one is getting that from Ken Paxton's bank account. Those are taxpayer dollars that they'll be getting. And another sort of wonky, but I think important instance of this is the Attorney General's office handles all these huge lawsuits, right, for the state. And one of them right now is against big tech. So one of the whistleblowers, guy named Darren McCarty, really high up in the Attorney General's office, he was running this lawsuit, which had been a years-long effort from the agency, really big case. Mm-hmm. And he was the person who was going to sort of pursue this. He was going to take the case all the way, right? And he was getting paid a public servant, six-figure salary, a salary that might sound nice to you or me, but not the kind of money that a lawyer can make doing that kind of big case. So he leaves, he resigns as one of the whistleblowers sort of in the wake of all this. And then the Attorney General's office brings in all of these outside law firms that are going to now take this case to trial, right? It's an important case. You need someone who's really good to take it to trial. But the thing is that when you bring on an outside attorney, you're now having to pay those people, and you're not paying them the $150,000 that an attorney might make working for the Attorney General's office. You're paying them tens and tens of millions of dollars out of the money that the state would otherwise recover for its own budget. So if Texas settles with Google for $100 million, I'm making these numbers up. I have no idea what a settlement might look like or whether it will settle, but a huge chunk of that is going to pay these outside lawyers. Whereas without all these problems, right, rewind to September 2020, the state of Texas wouldn't have had to pay those people, according to our reporting and to the reporting of others. And so that is a sort of roundabout way of looking at the cost that this has for the state budget and for taxpayers, right? That's tens of millions of dollars that under a different attorney general or under the same attorney general under different circumstances, the state would not have to spend.
Which is insane on its own, paying for these external law firms, paying for any potential settlements. But it's doubly insane when you consider how adamant people were about not paying prosecutors in the initial case $300 an hour. So again, doubly insane. That can't be right. That's the whole premise of the show. So you've kind of laid out what Ken Paxton was doing, what he's been accused of even more recently. If people are unsatisfied with his governance of his office, I mean, this financial lack of responsibility in having to bring in these external law firms, what can people do? You mentioned like you're someone that pays attention to your state lawmakers. Like how can people make sure they're staying on top of what's happening in their state?
Well, first of all, I recommend you read all of your local news sources, of course, the Texas Tribune, but this was such a great effort by so many different newspapers in Texas, the Houston Chronicle, the Dallas Morning News, the Austin American-Statesman, of course, the Associated Press has been all over the story. And so follow their work. It's really great. But also, these people work for you, right? Elected officials work for you if you pay taxes. And I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind. So if you had an employee and you hated what they were doing, what would you do? You would call them, you would tell them, you would maybe try to fire them if you could. And the way you fire an elected official is in an election. Mm-hmm. So if people are not satisfied with how this works, they can reach out to the office. There's a phone number and an email address. You can find it on their website where they, take public feedback. You can think about running for office against them. You can think about donating to a campaign opponent. These are all options that are available to you. We know that the number one thing politicians care about is reelection. And so if that is something that, if voters are unhappy with their elected officials, that's what they should be thinking about too.
Right. And then Texas Attorney General doesn't have any term limit, so he could run again no matter how many cases or allegations are hanging over his head.
he has said that he will run again in 2022, which is when he's up for re-election. I think there are people who sort of doubt that will happen, whether because of any criminal charges that may emerge that haven't emerged yet, or simply because other Republicans will run against him and say, enough is enough. We don't think you're the right choice for our state right now. But as of now, he said he's planning to run again next year.
What confidence? And this is kind of out of order, but in your opinion, why do you think this hasn't reached a national level, received a lot of national coverage? Because when Ken Paxton was in the news for bringing these lawsuits in the aftermath of the 2020 election, I feel like it definitely kind of got brushed over, that there was a lot of stuff going on in his home state that he could be focusing on.
I think there has been some national coverage. As a reporter covering a story, you always think that your story is the most important thing in the world and you wish everyone was talking about it. But I think in general, we're seeing that our politics are becoming really nationalized. And in a lot of cases, when you interview voters, I cover politics. I interview voters all the time on election day and constituents at other times. People are really aware generally of their federal officials. Who's their U.S. senator from their state, who's the presidential candidate they prefer. But I don't think that people pay as much attention to state government. And state government is much closer to you, right, than the president. You're, in Texas, your state senator has 1 million constituents and your U.S. senator has 30 million constituents. So you're that much more likely to be listened to if you reach out to one of those people.
Gotcha. For sure. Emma, I don't have any other questions about Ken Paxton. I feel like I can go impress everybody at a dinner party when those are safe to have. And I feel like it's given a really good picture of Republican politics, conservative politics in Texas. If people want to read everything you've ever written, where can they find you on the internet?
Many, many more Ken Paxton stories than anyone other than you would probably have interest in, available at texastribune.org.
Emma, this was super fantastic. Thank you so much. Emma Platoff, reporter at the Boston Globe, formerly at Texas Tribune. Thank you for joining me on That Can't Be Right.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Emma for joining me on That Can't Be Right. It's possible that between the recording and the release of this episode and you discovering this podcast, that Ken Paxton has gotten caught up in some more weird stuff. So sorry if we missed it. Don't forget to check out the episode description for links to some of Emma's work at the Texas Tribune and the Boston Globe. Do whatever it takes for new episodes to end up on your phone automatically, and then do whatever it takes for new episodes to end up on your phone automatically, like that U2 album everyone loved. Don't forget to connect with That Can't Be Right on Twitter and Instagram at TCBRPod. And if there's something that you think can't be right, send me an email, thatcan'tberiightpodcast@gmail.com. Go meditate to recenter your peace now. Bye.